This podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not intended to replace therapeutic services of any kind. Please refer to the list of references provided if you need support.
Welcome, everybody, to another Sessions with Sara Cate and Ashley. I am Ashley.
I am Sara Cate.
Today, we are having a conversation about grief. And, before we get into it, we're going to just name a few things. This is our conversation with grief that we're inviting you into. So we are fully aware that we come from our own experiences. We have our own cultures and beliefs and backgrounds and how we grew up, and that shapes how we deal with grief and how we recognize grief, how we move through grief. And yours is likely different than ours. And so this conversation is not meant to be by any means like the only way to move through grief, or these are the only thoughts about grief. I think grief is a lifelong process for yourself, but even somebody who studies grief as a living, like their work isn't over in their lifetime, because it's such a vast topic, and there are just so many depths and so many things that come with grief. And then we also recognize that there are many different kinds of griefs. We are going to talk about loss. And so that's something to know, that if, again, like we always say, like if you need to step away, if this isn't for you in this moment, that's okay. It might be that you come back to it later. It might be that you just skip this episode. But remember that there are many different kinds of grief. There are griefs from the loss of someone or something. There's anticipatory grief. There's delayed grief. There's complicated grief. There's a grief that you find when maybe it is somebody who has passed and it was a really kind of sucky relationship, but there's still some grief there, and like what goes on. We're going to talk more about that specifically, actually, but we are aware that there's different kinds, and there's no way for us to cover all of them, but we are opening this space for you to come into this offering of us talking about grief. And so here we go.
We were both were reflecting on how constricted we felt in our bodies around this conversation. I think I have known that this was going to be something that we've shared in on a session. I knew it was going to come up, but I'm glad we've waited the weeks we've waited, because I think I've needed every minute of every day leading up to being able to have this conversation. I've experienced personally 2 major losses in my life recently in the last 6 months. So it was definitely coming into this conversation today. It's been in my heavy on my mind and in my body, knowing that I will likely have some emotion come up as we talk through this and walk through this together. My story is my own, as is yours, is your own. And so, like Ashley said, what I share comes from my understanding of grief from a clinical perspective, but more so I think I'm going to share today from the platform of my own process and what I've witnessed in others and in their process as I've journeyed with them through their grief. Sometimes there are some days I've got it together, and then there are definitely days that I don't. And whatever that means, right? Like that we should have something together when we're dealing with a loss, or that we should be perceived by the world to have moved on and moved through, and that it ends because a timeline has expired, right? That like, no, it's been 6 months, so you should be whatever, So there's just, I think the number one offering from today that I hope that we can really illuminate is that, like, this is, as you said earlier when Ashley and I were talking, like a lifelong process. Like grief takes time, and it is not linear. It doesn't go in one direction. We don't click the stages and then we get to move on and be done. It is an ever ebbing and flowing experience.
So maybe we should start and touch on those 5 stages, because we have all heard them. And
Yes. Yeah.
we have all been told denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So that is the order that we are told they go in. And if we're not careful, we can get a really strong message that that is the way that we are supposed to move through them. And that is the order, and it has to be like that. And then once you go through one, then you're done with
Click, check.
Yeah. So
Never going back to that one.
yeah. So they, yes, are very real. The stages of grief are very real and they're present. But we want to take a little time to talk about what does that look like to move in and out of them, and why we might do that. Yeah.
Well, and like, this is an old model, right? Like, this is coming from the Kubler-Ross model, but like, this is outdated, to be completely honest. And like Ashley was saying, like, the fact that we believe that we believed at a time that we would just like walk through these 5 stages and then be done with whatever it was that we were grieving, is pretty off mark of the way that grief moves. And I know, and I had just recently heard, and I need to look this up, but that someone has adapted it and added another stage. And I cannot remember what it is right now offhand, but to think that we're going to go through our denial of whatever we've lost or what change has occurred, then hit anger, rage a little bit, then start to bargain around what it is, that did we really care? Is it that significant? Yada, yada. Moving into the depression of it, of just like the heaviness, the density, kind of what Ashley and I were talking about, we were feeling was just this like gravity, this gravitational force that grief can actually be in our bodies. And then the acceptance of like, love and loss, it's all part of the cycle and we're done. Right. And that there's this like compartmentalized way to just click through them and be done. It just isn't true. And so I think even when I read those, I think experiencing them, however you experience denial, however you experience anger, right? Like how it becomes such a mixed bag when we're going through it. Like, you can be in denial and be angry about it, right? Like, and that's where I think we get confused sometimes when we try to say it's a step-by-step process, or that we only have so much time and then we need to be done with it, because those two might live together, or like even anger and depression, right? They seem like they might not go hand in hand, but they absolutely can. You can have this like really deep, fire in your belly about the fact that this loss has occurred, and be also really heavy and slow and not able to engage in your life. Like, those two things can be concurrent. And so I think really opening this to be more of a conversation about flow and freedom to grieve in your way. Grieve in what shows up, how it's showing up, feel it, acknowledge it, name it, and see what happens next, see what changes, right? And so that kind of what we've touched on in the previous sessions around starting to notice things in your body. Grief is one that, to be quite honest with my clients and even with myself, it's quite identifiable. Like, it's an easy one for me to find.
I still feel a little nauseous right now. And to be totally candid, we both cried before this episode.
We got our tissues right here.
We have our
primed and ready.
We have our tissues. And so, but I think also, even when you get to, or if you're experiencing the acceptance, I think the acceptance phase was put there as like a finalized, okay, you accept it. And now we just move about our life as if it's just like Sara said, like joy and loss, it's all the same. And unfortunately, that like really diminishes the impact that if it was a person, we'll just like speak to the loss of a person, it completely diminishes the importance that they had in our life. And I don't know about you, but I'm not trying to do that. I'm
Mhm.
not trying to diminish. And so, like, yes, have I accepted loss? For sure. It doesn't mean that it's awesome. It doesn't mean that I'm happy about it. But so yeah, so just, recognizing that even though these stages, they are helpful to use as identification sometimes. And we've talked
Mhm.
about how, yes, maybe the order is, outdated, and like that we're going to move, or that there's a timeline that's all outdated. And I think we can all understand that, but also recognizing that it is helpful to identify where we're at, because like Sarah said, it helps you figure out what's going to happen next,
Mhm.
or what step to take next.
Yeah, and like the permission to feel it, right? Like, I think that oftentimes too, I will have so many people say, I know I should be over it by now. And when we're working together, like, I know I shouldn't still be feeling this, or I know I should. And I have to just always bring in the pause button and say, tell me why. How, when were you told
Yeah.
that what you were feeling is inappropriate,
Yeah.
or it needs to change, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes it happens in our childhood.
Yeah. Or, I mean, so I literally just had a conversation about this with a client a few hours ago, and she had a pet that died. And it was, I worked with her like while the whole process was going on, and it was, there was anticipatory grief. There was like a big diagnosis to the pet's health. It was sudden. And then there was this anticipatory, like, okay, but it hasn't happened yet, like this sudden change, but now like we're just waiting. And then, the loss actually happened. And we get this message from society a lot of times from work, because she did go back to work, right? She took a few days off and then she went back to work. But just because she was back at work did not mean that she was fully okay. That didn't mean that she was done. But we get this message that we are to be professional in certain situations, like at work. And what can happen, maybe unintentionally, maybe sometimes intentionally, is that when you have to, quote, act professionally, you remove the experience of being human
and emotions.
And so now here she is. She's grieving the loss of like this, pet that was part of her life for a long time, and it was super special to her. And she's telling me I should be over it. No, you shouldn't. And it's not up to me to tell you how important this thing was in your life. It's not for your boss to tell you how important this thing was in your life. It's not up to anybody. You get to decide how important it was. But unfortunately, our society just like wants to minimize these losses sometimes because they don't fully understand. And that's the thing, like we all have such different lives. And so what affects me might not be the same as you, and that's okay, but it is not up to you, and it's not up to me to tell the other how we should grieve and how we should move through it and when we should be over it.
I mean, yeah, I'm just noticing some of the angst I have in my body about that.
I know.
Just like I get so defensive and I get so protective over my clients when their process is not honored. And, when my process isn't honored, right? Like that just, I was shut down so much, in a lot of capacities, and sometimes even through like the religious upbringing that I had, around it, which was like, well, they've gone to heaven now. And so we have to be just, grateful. And when I was 16 years old, I had my first loss, and it was my grandparents were significant caregivers to me growing up. They were like my parents. I was with them as much as I was with my own mom and dad. And so I was very lucky to have these significant and profound relationships with them. And so when I experienced that loss at 16, and I was very involved in the dying process of my grandmother. And so I saw things at 16 that were a bit much for me, to be quite honest. Like, I think developmentally, it wasn't really what I should have been a part of.
Yeah.
But because death is a really, really ugly, hard process. As the physical body dies. Right. And so it was I got very angry because this God, this religion that I was like told was supposed to keep us safe and protect us, that was like really preached to me my entire life, literally abandoned to me, I perceived abandoned my grandmother in this moment with the amount of pain that she felt and with the how gnarly that end of life process was. I was like, this is not beautiful. This is not, I'm not just handing her over to the heavens. Right. So like I carried this anger in my body about it for a very long time. And it was really disruptive for me because I was then at war now with this belief system that I had been given, that was supposed to make me feel better about all of this, and it made me feel worse. It kind of shattered my world. And so it wasn't even just the loss of my grandmother, it was then a loss of like this trust and this faith that I had been taught, growing up. So that for me was kind of my first interaction with grief, and it wasn't good. It was bad. So I think that then I learned very quickly I had to shut that shit down. I did not want to feel that stuff anymore. And then I had and then the losses continued. I lost my grandfather when I was 20, and he was like my person, my dude. Like he was it for me. He is on the pedestal. He was the most transformative human in my life. Such an incredible person. And so I got into a really significant relationship right when I lost him. I got married very quickly after that. I mean, I look back now and I look at the choices that came out of my not feeling my grief, and I'm like, whoa, maybe had we processed that, things would have looked a little differently. I am now divorced. So we can see how well that played out as a mechanism of survival, getting married. But I really do see the imprints from the first. I didn't have the right tools and I didn't have the right support. I should have seen a therapist at that age. My parents also didn't know how to handle it. They were grieving themselves. And, it was just an interesting time, I think. And therapy wasn't something we really, I remember my mom maybe offering that, wasn't something that we really talked about with grief. And I'm like, we should have all had it. We should have all had that support. She lost her mother. I lost my grandmother. Like, that she was going to have her own experience with it and needed to and deserved to. Right. And so I just think as I can see how when we do not make room for the process and allow for the anger to be there, like, yeah, you are really angry, and to name it and to acknowledge it. And like, it would make me angry too, to watch somebody I care about be in that much pain. And that's okay that you feel that. Right. Like there was no permission. There was no like validation of those big feelings in such a young person. And so it's definitely really adjusted, unfortunately, for a long time how I grieved. And then I would just get really stuck in some of the stages of it. And these two losses, I lost my other grandmother who was 100, the Energizer Bunny. She just lived on and lived on and lived on. She was 100 years old. And then her daughter, my aunt, passed away around 8 days after she passed this August. So she was battling cancer for a couple of years. And so it was so interesting. Like, to your point, the anticipatory grief of my grandmother, she was diagnosed with lymphoma for 5 years prior to her passing. So we were always anticipating her death. And that was living in my body in a really weird way. And then my aunt's was tragic, and it was kind of fast for a lot of reasons. And she passed when she was, 68 years old. So like, to see my grandmother at 100 and my aunt at 68 pass within a week of each other was also revolutionary in the way that I had to grieve, because I'm grieving an anticipatory grief that I've been like waiting for. And we've been waiting for it for her, right? Like her quality of life was really low. But then with my aunt, her being so young to me and being such a significant person in my life, like to lose her then at the same time where I'm like, yeah, but I feel okay and was ready to release my grandmother and not her. And so then I'm like in this push pull in my body, and it has been, it's taken me for a ride.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And I just feel like after all of these months, there's a little bit of me coming back to myself. Even now having this conversation of just like feeling like that 16-year-old girl who really, I didn't give myself permission to be as angry as I was about my aunt, because I was trying to be really grateful that my grandma was gone, and she was able to be free of this life in a body that really had failed her. And So it's such a convoluted thing. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about this conversation, and, obviously feeling lots of things right now. But to give people permission to like, not have a fucking process,
Yeah.
like, be where you're at,
Mhm.
be angry, be in denial. Like, there are moments that I still, she's always lived in Tennessee and I've always lived in Michigan. And so we always have this distance between us. And there are many moments that she is still alive to me in my head. That denial is strong, where I'm like,
Yeah.
I can pick up the phone and call. I can send
Yeah.
the text, because
Yeah.
we've always lived
Yeah.
with distance between us. And so it's a really, really important, it's an important part of the process to be where you are.
Yeah.
And I, even as a clinician, even as a person who's done this, even as a person who recognizes when they were 16, it didn't go well, so I should do it different. I still didn't. There are
Yeah.
still parts of me that are shutting down certain emotions and judging certain emotions, and, feeling like I should just be able to carry on, and it still lingers. And so, like, that compassion that I'm really trying to offer out into the world to you, I'm also trying to offer it back to myself in this, because I don't care what when you're in the moment. Sometimes it is hard. It is hard to remember to allow. And also it hurts too much sometimes to allow.
For sure. For sure. Okay, well, thanks for sharing. I feel like we need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. A little exposed.
You did great.
Little vulnerability hangover right now. But I'm good.
But
Oh God.
So, one of the things that she talked about, didn't like name it like this, but she talked about there being a dichotomy of two things being true. She was grateful that her grandmother was not suffering, and she was like super mad that her aunt was gone. And I think when I was grieving my grandma, one of the things that like I found myself thinking about it so much. I couldn't really comprehend that I could be I've never been more sad. Like, so far in the depths of sadness, but so far in the depths of gratitude, just because.
Yep. Okay.
So, because I had her.
That you got to experience that love.
Yeah. And that, like, how, which I think this is where a lot of. Here's a tissue. Sara Cate just handed me a tissue.
That's love.
That is love. That, like, how incredible that, like, there are people who touch us like that. And then, like, the anger comes in when people tell you that you should be over it. Like, fuck that. Because I'm not gonna be, clearly.
Yeah.
Like, until the day I die, will miss her just as much as I did when she was alive, because I didn't live in the same place as her, And there are still, so this happened in January of 2021. There are still times where I call my grandpa and I expect her to answer, because I call their house. My grandpa has a cell phone. He's just not very good at using it. So I just still call their landline. And there are so many times where I expect her to answer, and then she doesn't, and then it's a little reminder. And then my grandpa always says, I always say I love you before I hang up the phone with him, and he always says, we love you too. And I'm like,
God, Ashley.
yeah. So
my guts just dropped out of my body.
Yeah. And so, but that's one of the things that I have appreciated about him. And, he is a man of few words. But it's one of the ways that, whether he realizes it or not, he has kept her alive for me. you know, because I know she still loves me, and he like makes sure that even in her absence,
Yeah.
I know that.
Right. And like exactly right there where that can be like such a tender,
Yeah.
sweet reminder that her love is still very present and also painful
Yes.
because it's a reminder that she's not present, right?
Yeah.
Like it just to your that point of holding the opposites, Ash,
Yeah.
of just like being able to feel both.
Yeah.
And this is why I think people avoid grief, because it is so painful.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is. It is so
It
hard
is.
to feel.
Super painful. Yeah. You know, it's also interesting. This just happened to me yesterday. So it's well, this episode will come out in a few weeks, but it is Mother's Day this weekend. And also in 2021, I had a miscarriage. And I am okay. Like, I feel fully complete in this process. And someone very well intended sent me a text message that said, "Hey, thinking of you on Mother's Day."
Mm.
Not somebody who's in my inner world either. And I got a little pissed off because I was, it felt yucky.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am, like I said, I'm complete in that process. I am a firm believer, and you'll never be able to convince me otherwise, that like when souls are supposed to be here, they will be here. And it wasn't the right time. And it was a true blessing,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest with you. And I can still have anger around the situation,
Mm-hmm.
or anger when my process
Mm-hmm.
is complete. But now it's brought up again.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, it's such an interesting like push-pull of like, hey, thanks for thinking about me. Not needed. I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
You know?
because I mean, but you're speaking to the fact that like, yes, there's a wholeness and a completeness in your process around it.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that external forces, external statements, feelings, thoughts, things that pop up can still drudge up emotion.
Yeah.
Right. Like you can have processed what you needed to for your own ability to kind of like move forward with wholeness around it. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to then still have no emotion around it.
Right.
It's you're still going to get sensation and emotion around something really intense in your life.
Yeah.
Like to think that we're just, when the grief process is over, or when the process, quote unquote, is over, and we've processed something, that then we have no emotional experience of it.
Totally. Yeah.
That then it becomes just vacant, and then we're just like, oh, it's nothing. It's no big deal. Not true.
Yeah. This is also, we meant in the very beginning of the episode, we mentioned like grieving the loss of, if it's a person that you had a really complicated relationship with.
Oof, yeah.
This is kind of that.
Right.
I
Because
had
there's
no
closure.
Yeah. I had a very complicated relationship with that thing, the miscarriage, with the pregnancy. I had a very complicated relationship. And like I said, truly, I believe that if a soul is supposed to be here, they will be here, and they will find their way, and it will happen when the exact perfect time that soul is supposed to arrive. And again, it was traumatic. It was the way it happened. It was traumatic. And again, I was so grateful. And there are times where we might experience a loss, and somebody else is processing it and trying to push their process onto you, telling you like, well, why haven't you cried? Why aren't you crying? You don't seem upset. Like, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? And they say no. Okay. That's okay. You don't have to. Your grief process, especially when the relationship is complicated, is not going to look the same. And it's okay to have multiple feelings about that process. And it's okay to grieve. Like we have talked, like when we're talking about our grandmas and Sarah's aunt, grieving the love that really was. But there's also grievance that can happen from a love that wasn't. And
yeah, and how layered that is.
yes,
because it's grieving the loss of an opportunity for that love to ever be there or change if the person is gone. If we're speaking specifically about losing a person, right? Like grieving the loss of the opportunity that it could change, it could get better, it could become something else. There could be redemption in this relationship. So you're grieving that loss. Then potentially you're grieving the loss of never having the love from that person that you wanted in the way that you wanted it. And then it's just like the actual, like, and the finality of it, right? Like how multidimensional and dynamic that process is. You know, I have some dear, dear, dear friends who have lost parents that they had extremely painful and complicated relationships with. And watching their processes has been heartbreaking to not only have watched them grieve their entire life while that person was alive, the fact that they didn't have that caregiver that they wanted. And specifically, I'm thinking about a friend who lost her mother. Her whole life, her mother wasn't there. And so she was grieving actively throughout her entire life, the fact that she didn't have a relationship with her mom that she wanted and craved. And then the finality of her mother passing, it was like, this is never going to change now.
Yeah.
And now I have to grieve that. I have to grieve the fact that I didn't have a mother still that was present. And I have to grieve the fact that my biological mother has passed. And where do you even begin to start to process the feelings that might come up in that, and how it could not even remotely be linear,
right,
or make sense, right? And like, so my offering an opportunity is always like, and what is it today? Where are you at with it today? You know, that's the check-in that I try to bring in, because who knows? And who knows how long we'll be grieving some of these relationships, or like, you know, and it's not even just, it's, you know, we're talking about like Ashley said, losses of people in our lives, but there's relationship where they're still alive. I mean, divorce to me has been a huge grief process. Because I'm grieving the loss of an idea of a relationship that I had. The relationship that I did have, and I'm grieving a person who's still alive. And living and functioning in the world. And so of course, you know, there's going to be hits of that, like to what I was saying to you, Ashley, like that I wouldn't, if I've processed my divorce, that at some point I wouldn't feel some sort of way about it again. That I won't get triggered about it again when I got, you know, into a new relationship or whatever it might be, right? Like, you know, the fact that we're supposed to just be done with these things and move on and then have no feeling about it again it's so absurd. And unfortunately, what I think it does is it really derails the process.
for sure.
It doesn't allow you to do the process.
For sure. Yeah. And, you know, hopefully if this episode does anything, it reminds you.
If it does anything. We don't know how useful we are. Actually had to talk me off that ledge.
But
episode 1, imposter syndrome.
Yeah. So truly, though, it is hopefully a reminder that these conversations are important and that they're not comfortable. Sometimes they may be more comfortable than others, for sure. But a lot of times it's going to be really fucking hard. But if we have the conversations in whatever capacity we can in that moment, we find community around with the people who are supportive, obviously, not the people who aren't helpful in your process. But when you have somebody, which is why connecting with somebody or having a facilitator is super helpful. But hopefully this just gives you that reassurance that if you want to have these conversations, you should have them and that you can, and that whatever your process looks like, it's perfect because it's exactly, yes, it's yours. And it's exactly in that moment what you need. And the next moment might be different, and that's okay.
Yeah. And to check in with, even ask that question of yourself. Like, I think that's where, when I offer that to friends and loved ones of where are you at today with it? You know, I really do try to do that with myself too, because there are some days that I'm just like, you know, I feel connected ancestrally and like spiritually to, those who have come before me. And then there are days that I don't, that I can't find them. And there are days that I'm going to cry about it on and off all day. And then there are days that I'm light and free. And like you said, celebratory of the love. And so, and it just, and if the loss was complicated and it was difficult, paying attention to the days that maybe you just don't feel anything about it at all. Like apathy, maybe that's the other one. The sixth stage, but like apathy, right? Where you just don't feel anything about it because it's just kind of like, I don't have the capacity to feel any more anger or any more freedom or whatever it might be. Right. So it's this constant checking in. What is my body telling me? What am I feeling? Yeah. And like, if this, Ash said, if this gives you anything, it's just this permission for your process and to maybe even open the door to exploring it a little more. Cause like I said, I know it's easy to shut down these feelings. It's easy to avoid the grief. Believe me, that's the denial process. And I love it sometimes.
Yeah.
Deny. But then I got to come back to it.
Yeah.
I gotta return. I have to return and let it move through so the next thing can come through.
Yeah. And it's so, like I will sometimes be laughing until I cry. My grandma was like one of the funniest people that I have ever known. And I will be laughing till I cry, talking about stories about her and her sisters and just things that her and I would do, or like songs she would make up about me being, lovesick with this boy named Justin when I was in like kindergarten.
It would be a Justin. That feels like an 80s baby's name.
Exactly. In front of all of her friends at the senior citizen center, she's like pounding away on the piano, and I will be crying it in laughter. And the next time I talk about her, I'm like sobbing into a tissue. And so the two things are still very much there. And I would rather know both than to like move further away from myself because
deny the feeling of it.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
so
on that lighthearted,
we are gonna end with a
offering,
with an awareness prayer from Pixie's book.
Yeah, Pixie Light Horse. So if you are going through something energetically around grief, I highly recommend this book. It's called Prayers for Honoring Grief by Pixie Light Horse, and I will link it or something. Ashley will link it. She knows how to do those things. But I highly recommend it because it honors Pixie's heritage and her traditions, and it honors the directions, so north, south, east, west, and the way that we move through grief. And I think it's a really beautiful way. And there's prayers from everything from, let's see here, prayers for honoring loneliness, prayers for honoring isolation, prayers for honoring tears, prayers for honoring a broken heart. So there's paralysis. I mean, they're just, it really speaks to me to the dynamic nature of grief, like way more. And it provides an offering. So remember that this, when we say prayer, it's coming through Pixie Light Horse's, her traditions, her roots, and her beliefs. So, you'll hear kind of some of that in this offering, but we decided to read, I read Ashley a couple that I was thinking of, and this is the one that she really felt like would be an incredible offering. And then as I've been sitting here thinking about it, it's prayer for honoring awareness. And I love this so much because literally this conversation, yes, is about grief, but it's about more becoming aware of how it shows up for us and the awareness in our own body. And like what we're really trying to do with this podcast in general is create just a stronger awareness.
She's catching on, folks.
She's see what she did there. To like really become more aware of how we feel things and what to then do to better take care of ourselves and tend our bodies, tend our hearts, tend our souls. So this is something that has helped me. So I'm going to offer it to all of you and hopefully end with a little bit of connection and support around a very, very difficult topic.
Yes.
Will I cry? Won't I cry? We will find out. Okay, so this is Pixie Light Horse's honoring awareness. Thank you for this transitional day of being part of the mystery. Thank you for this unexpected information and change of course. Help me overcome my fear of how it will inform my future. Calm my uneasiness about what is being presented. When I am blindsided, soften my breath and let me feel its influence on me. During these times, I forget what works well for me. Keep me close to you by bringing my attention to the tension rising in me. Provide a cushion for my rigidity. Soothe my desire to numb out and activate my miraculous systems for coping. Circulate my blood while I navigate this strange territory. Help me stay open. Help me trust that I can get through this. When I sense that I am contracting, help me lean into trust. Mellow my heart's rhythms when it engages in a race with my thoughts. When change is threatening to unhinge me, untether me from my illusions of safe harbor, help me remember that the earth anchors me, that I am equipped to handle what will unfold, and that I have seen dissolution before and made it through. Ease my need for comfort at the expense of presence. Help me call out to the feelings. Help me navigate this starless night road on which I feel so helpless. Help me be with this turn of events roiling in my body and tame my overactive mind. Turn me toward the mirror so I can accept myself even in desperation. Help me appreciate my form when I cannot get myself together as I am supposed to. Remind me that I can be awake to what is happening and manage fear at the same time. Inject me with a reminder that I didn't come this far to abandon myself now. Ugh, thank you, dear Pixie.
So
You've carried me.
good.
Your words have carried me.
Okay, so please, our information is in the show notes. Please reach out. There's also other resources if you are struggling, and take care of your hearts. Bye.
Sending love.